Okay, so for 12.2, there's another way that we can write hypotheses. I mentioned earlier that if you were doing a test that involved a single proportion, we would use the one prop Z test. And this test is highlighted in section 10.2. If we had two independent samples, we would use the two prop Z test. And that test is explained in section 11.1. So there will be situations where we will have three or even more proportions. And we don't have a 3-prop Z test or a 4-prop Z test. So we kind of do them all with this chi-squared test. And this one is not the chi-squared test of independence, it's the chi-squared test of homogeneity. For groups to be homogeneous, that means that they're alike in some way. So homogeneous is a play on that word. Everything about this test is exactly how we explained in the test for independence in section 12.2, how we calculate the conditional proportions. The big difference is the null hypothesis. Instead of saying that variable one in a contingency table, crosstab sometimes we call it, the null hypothesis is a statement that there's no relationship between the two variables. Here's the other test. If we have three groups, we're going to say the proportion in the first group is equal to the proportion of the second group is equal to the proportion of the three groups. All three groups are the same. They're homogeneous in some way. And so that's why we call it the chi-squared test of homogeneity. But this is really the only difference for running this chi-squared test than the earlier test, the chi-squared test for independence. Now, if we happen to have a fourth group here and we were doing 4 proportions, then we would just tack on to the end of this one equals P4 equals P5 and so on. Depends on how many groups you have. Usually we don't have that many, but most of our problems, it might just be 3. All right, so what I thought we would do is take a look at an example in this case. And so you have this problem here. And the one thing that is key here is that these samples are taken, they are independent samples. So what we're going to assume is that we take a random sample of Democrats, a random sample of independents, and a random sample of Republicans. All right, so we take a sample from each of those and we get an X1, an X2, and an X3, an N1, an N2, and an N3. And, from those two numbers, we can calculate a P1 hat, a P2 hat, and a P3 hat. So it's kind of just going up one dimension from the 2-proportion Z test that we did back in chapter 11. It's just we have 3 groups now. This particular one, in this survey, like our survey, they asked 2 categorical variables. First of all, they said, what's your party affiliation? Are you more aligned to the Democrats, to the independents, or to the Republicans? So then they would select the multiple choice there. And so the data value would look like Democrat, 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 Independent, Independent, Democrat, Independent, Republican, Republican. Just a bunch of Democrats, Independents, Republicans would be the raw data there. Then they ask them another question, and it has to do with the word socialism. You may recall that Bernie Sanders, who was a recent candidate for the Democratic nomination to the presidency, he referred to himself as a democratic socialist. And that word itself has a negative connotations for many individuals. So the question is, do Democrats think of that word react differently to that word than, say, the independents or the Republicans? Are there any differences? So the first thing we do to decide if there are differences among the three groups is we would add up these column totals. So add these two numbers to get the column totals, and do the same thing with these other two groups, and then add the row totals as well. So we can get a sense of you know, the different sample sizes and the different sample proportions that we're going to calculate here. All right, then we're going to add up the row totals. As you can see, every group tended to not react favorably at a higher rate than they reacted favorably. All right, so even the Democrats here, more Democrats had a negative view of that word socialism than had a positive view of that word socialism. Independents, same thing. Much more negative view of that word than positive. And then Republicans, same thing, a much greater negative reaction to the word socialism than a positive reaction. So all groups refer to or have a more of a negative reaction to the word socialism than a positive. Okay, adding up all these numbers in the second row, we get 1040. And then if you add those two numbers, you get our total, kind of the pooled sample size of all the groups. So these two numbers add to 1466, and those three numbers add to 1466. All right, now we're going to go through and calculate the conditional proportions using the different groups, the political affiliations, Democrats, independents, and Republicans as the independent variable. So we are going to calculate the conditional proportions using the column totals. So we're going to divide both of these two numbers by the 499. We'll divide these two numbers by their column total, 554. And similarly, we'll divide the Republican counts here by the total 413. And then we'll compare the conditional proportions. All right. So 220 divided by 499. And I'll round that to 3 decimal places. I'll put it over here, 0.441. And you'll notice that these two numbers will add up to 1. All right, so 44% have a positive view of the word, positive reaction to the word socialism if they're Democrats, and about 56% would have of the Democrats have a negative view of the word socialism. Let's compare that to the other groups. These here. This one would be, I'm just going to call it 0.260. And then if we take the 410 divided by 554, or 1 minus 0.260, you're going to get 0.740. So you can see, compared to Democrats, independents have a much higher negative reaction to the word socialism than the Democrats. Only about a fourth have a positive reaction to that word. And then moving over here, 62 divided by 413, 0.150, which would make this 0.850, because these two numbers have to add up to 1. All right, so we clearly see differences here in terms of of the three parties and just turn these into percentages. And you could say that who has a positive positive reaction to the word socialism. Democrats, it's 44%. Independents, it's 26%. But Republicans, it's only 15% have a positive reaction to the word socialism. So we see some differences. And we're probably going to get a very statistically significant difference here because we've got a difference of almost 30 percentage points between Democrats and Republicans here. All right, so let's take a look. Now, if you were to transfer these numbers over here, for the Democrats, we have to choose the X to be a success. We either have to choose it as the positive or the negative. So I'll choose it as the positive. So we'll have 220 out of the 499. And then the p hat in this case would be 0.441 if you divide those numbers. Over here, the x2 would be the 144. And the n2 would be the 554. And then the p hat, 0.60. And then over here, for the Republicans, we have 62 out of 413. And if you divide those two, you're going to get the 0.150. So 44.1% versus 26.0% compared to 15.0%. Quite a large difference in the three groups in terms of their positive reaction to the word socialism. We see differences, and now we want to do the test to see if those differences are statistically significant. All right, so matrix A would look like this: 220, 144, 62. These come from our samples in this case. So the calculator can calculate the expected values from just those 6 numbers. And there are 2 rows and there are 3 columns. So you have to enter in a 2x3 matrix into A, then run the chi-squared and distribution or chi-squared test function, and then you can go look at matrix B to see the expected values. The conditional proportions are what you want to calculate just so you can determine what the differences are. It's going to help you write the conclusion at the end. We're going to say, as we always do in the null hypothesis, is that there's no difference. In this case, there's no difference between the proportion of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans that respond positively to the word socialism. Now, the alternative, we're going to say into words. And the way that you have a competing hypothesis for this null hypothesis, it says all of these population proportions are the same. To negate this statement that all the proportions are the same, all you need is just a single proportion that's different than the others. And so this way of writing the alternative hypothesis is kind of, almost exactly word for word how we're going to write the alternative. All right, so P1 we'll call the Democrats, P2 we'll call the Independents, and P3 the Republicans, and then the alternative, at least one of the above proportions is not like the other. And because of the way that we selected these proportions, these sample proportions are the percentage that actually have a positive reaction to the word socialism. And you can see, less than half have a positive reaction. All right, so we'll go to the matrix, edit the matrix, 2x3, enter the words, 2, 3, and the numbers, 220, 144, 62, 279, 410, 351, and then quit. Then we run the test. But you have to have the matrix in there first to run the test. This is option C. All of these inputs are the same. You may recall that the degrees of freedom is the number of rows minus 1 times the number of columns minus 1. So 2 minus 1 times 3 minus 1, 1 times 2 is 2. So some of you also threw into the chat box the degrees of freedom is 2. That is also correct. Calculate, and there you have it. The test statistic is the chi-squared test statistic. And the p-value, yeah, so we're not going to write 9.8 here. This is times 10 to the negative 22. So it's like if you took that decimal point and moved it 22 places to the left, essentially it's 0. And the way that we normally would write that would just be 4 significant digits and rounded to 4 decimal places, 0.0000. But it's not 0, it's just rounded to 4 decimal places, it's 0. And sometimes when you do a test like this, it'll actually report that p is equal to 0. It's just that it's so small that it doesn't register. But the p-value is based on one sample, and there's always a chance, so it can't be just 0. P is less than alpha, so we're going to reject the null hypothesis. And if we reject the null hypothesis, we're rejecting that there's no difference in the reaction of the 3 groups to the word socialism. And clearly from our sample results, we do see that there is quite a lot of variation in how the different affiliated groups respond to that word. All right, so degrees of freedom is 2. This is a chi-squared distribution. If degrees of freedom equals 2, so I'll somehow mark that on my little graph here, and then I'll get out my table, and we have alpha equals 0.05. So alpha we need, and we need degrees of freedom. There's the alpha, and then there's the second row. So 5.991. And this guy, we're going to be plotting on this scale. And so it's just going to go way over there. But it's definitely in the reject region. So from the classical approach, our decision based on the p-value approach is confirmed. Went back and peeked at your expected values matrix. This is what you would see. And what you should notice is that those expected values add up to the same column totals as your original data distribution. 499, 554, 413. Same numbers up here. And here's one way of writing the conclusion. So we rejected the null hypothesis. So we rejected that there was no, that all the proportions were the same, that all 3 groups responded to the word, reacted to the word socialism at the same rate. We saw that that was not the case. So we rejected that claim. So what we want to say is that there's evidence that there's a big difference between adults with different political affiliations. Now, while no political group has a larger positive reaction than negative reaction to the word socialism, every single group 44% versus 56%, 26% versus 74%, and 15% versus 85%. Every single group has a more negative reaction to the word socialism than a positive reaction. So while that is the case, Democrats have a much higher positive reaction than either independents and Republicans. Republicans seem to have a much more negative reaction to the word socialism than either independents or Democrats.